Okay, in terms of the stuff, as always, just bad news. Deadline says they've been all along. Exam number 1, quizzes part 2. Deadline 5, May 28th. End of day, 11 to 9 p.m. Exam 2, quizzes part 3. Deadline 5, June 9th. Exam 3, deadline 5 is June 17th. And then exam 4, quizzes part 4, exam 5. Deadline 5 is 17th. Also end of day. For the paper, if you want to do a draft, deadline's on June 10th. With a draft, you just print a copy, bring it to me, either drop it in my drop envelope from my office door, or drop it off during office hours, drop it off during class. It takes me about 15 minutes to get through one, so if you drop it off during office hours, I'll get it back to you during office hours. If you drop it off at the end of class, I'll get it back to you either at office hours or the next class. Or I can leave it in the pickup envelope, also in my door. For the drafts, again, I put comments on them and put a tentative, draft grade on it, but be sure to, when you finish your paper, be sure to upload it to the appropriate, if you're having it in by June 11th, be sure to upload to Blackboard for the +5 bonus, or if you wait to the 15th, usually full credit, and June 18th, the half credit. But be sure, if you do a draft, be sure to upload your final version to Blackboard, because that's the one I actually grade.
So there's not a draft due for?
There can be. Well, basically, the due date is basically suggested that if you need to pass the course, like if you need to keep, financial aid or graduate, that's a good time to have at least something done. But there's no penalty for not doing it. So the draft is basically essentially like optional. Again, highly recommended if you need to pass the course to keep a financial aid or graduate or whatever, then you probably want to do one. But if you don't do one, then there'd be no penalty. You would just get whatever grade you get on the final version of the paper you turn in. Anything else? Okay, so last time we're looking at our good dead friend David Hume, talking about his Hume stuff, and we looked at the various and sundry problems he saw for regards to problem evil, and then we turned to look at immortality of the soul, and we saw that he laid out his main sort of objections. First kind of thing was, substance is really weird type of argument, and then went to the arguments from morality, which is the argument for immortality is there has to be immortality to have justice, in the afterlife, and he replies to that. And then we turn to the final thing for Hume, the physical arguments. Before going to this though, wrapping up Hume, going to Kant, and then taking a look at our good dead friend Blaise Pascal, which sounds either like an action hero or a porn star. Anything about our previous guys that need more stuff, or both. Okay, so Dave Hume, again, what he's doing is he believes, or believed because he's pretty dead, that there were 3 main ways to try to argue for immortality. Metaphysical, thinks those fail. The moral arguments, thinks those fail. And then lastly, physical arguments. Now the first one he gives is what could be called the sleep argument. And the gist of it seems to be this, that when we go to sleep, our self sort of becomes discombobulated. We dream, and sometimes, everyone's probably experienced this, sometimes you fall asleep, and you wake up and you have like no recollection. You don't recall your dreams or anything. So it seems kind of like you're gone. And what Hume argues is that sleep kind of disrupts the soul, then death should totally destroy the soul. And so it's basically, the gist of the sleep argument is if sleep kind of messes up our soul, so to speak, we'd expect something more extreme, like death, to totally destroy it, or so he claims. Next is his proportion argument, which is this. When people are first born, like day one, how strong are babies? Could you like toss them out in the wild and have them survive? No. How smart are babies? Are they geniuses? No. But of course, as people get older, they develop more and more capabilities until we hit our peak at about age 26. It's usually about the physical peak, and after that, it's just a slide to death. And then, of course, mentally, same sort of deal. You hit like the mental peak, and then gradually slides off. Now, what Hume argues is this: if we have sort of that, really, really young, starting off with weak physicality, weak, mentally, and then we hit our peak, and then we sort of slide off. We'd expect that when we die, that we have a comparable dissolution, that death would mean the end of all the self, or so he claims. The condition argument basically is an argument by analogy. And here's how the analogy goes. Suppose you take a moose, and you put the moose at the bottom of the Marianas Trench. What happens to the moose? Would it be good for the moose? Would the moose be happy? No, under all that water, the moose would probably be instantly crushed. It'd be a bad day to be that moose. Now suppose you took a fish from the bottom of the trench and transported it to, like, here. Would that be good for that fish? No, it'd probably, like, explode, which would be bad for the fish. Now, so what would be the point of that kind of analogy? Well, the analogy is this. Hume says that if you take something out of its natural environment, doesn't use the example of the moose, we take the moose and put it, at the bottom of Marianas Trench, destroys the moose. Take a fish off the bottom of Marianas Trench, bring it up here, destroys the fish. He says by analogy, if the soul goes out of the body, like a fish out of water, it should perish, by analogy. Now, of course, like any analogy, like the one for the paper, this hinges on the similarities between the two. So the analogy would be fish is to water as soul is to body. And so kind of the question would be, do we occupy our body, in terms of the soul, like a fish in water? If the soul comes out, would it perish? And so just like with any analogy, the question would be, are there enough similarities? Are they relevant? Are there relevant dissimilarities? But that's his argument. Now he throws out the animal thing again. Again, kind of his point is, like with the animal argument and the woman argument, is he's aiming at people he's arguing against. People who think that animals are immortal and women are inferior to men. And he says if we believe that the souls of animals are immortal, or they don't have souls, again by analogy, if we're like animals, animals are not immortal, therefore we're not immortal. Argument by analogy. Then he gives the change argument. If we look around the universe, we see everything constantly changes. Things come into existence, go out of existence, perish, born, perish, etc. And he basically says it'd be really, really weird for the soul to be the only thing that's immortal. So, sort of an argument like, well, everything else seems to go out of, to fail and change, so it should apply to the soul as well. Or so he claims. So the recap basically is, well, sleep kind of messes us up, so death should probably wipe us out. In our youth, we're, proportionally weaker and less capable. Then we get to a peak, and then we, start the downward slide. And so death should take care of that as well. If the soul is in the body like a fish in a pond, taking the soul out of the body should destroy it. Animals are mortal. If we assume that, we're like animals, so we're mortal too. Everything changes. So why should our soul be an exception? It should perish too. Now, sort of a side point he makes is kind of an interesting question. Namely, where do all the dead people go? The infinite, as he notes, in kind of an interesting point, that every planet in the universe could be populated. And if all those souls are immortal, they're constantly dying. And it's basically kind of a question of where do you put them all? Which is a good question. Where do they all go? Now, of course, one obvious answer is, if you look at most religions, the souls, people die, the souls go off to heaven, which is not here. Which could, in theory, if you believe in a heaven that's infinite, it could store all those souls. Another possible response is, if souls don't have any, three-dimensionality, it's like the old metaphysical question from the Middle Ages. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? And if souls have no dimensions, how many can you put in one place? Well, the answer would be infinite. So perhaps a way of replying to that. He also claims that what could be called the lack of argument. Namely, there's no argument that supports a claim of immortality, therefore, it's not something we should accept. The insensibility argument goes like this. When we think about what was before us, we have no awareness of that. I mean, you can obviously go and look at books and movies and so forth, but we have no sensibility of what was occurring before we existed. Likewise, we'd expect the same will occur after death, so no immortality. Now, next to the last thing, interestingly or morally enough, one argument given for immortality was this. The idea is that nature doesn't give us desires that we cannot fulfill. Now, that doesn't mean that every single desire a person gets they can achieve. Like if someone wants to be, like a famous Hollywood director, it doesn't guarantee the ability to achieve that. But the claim was that in general, sort of the general desires that people have somehow, we wouldn't have those unless there's some way of satisfying them, supposedly. And the claim is that we desire immortality, and that we're afraid, of death. And so the question, basically the thing would be is that since we're really, really afraid of death, and we really want immortality against natural desire, so it's got to be the case that we're immortal. Now Hume's reply is basically this. Even if we accept that nature does nothing in vain, that there's a reason behind everything, our fear of death is not proof of immortality. Why? Well, a way to explain it kind of alternatively is that even though we can't postpone, death inevitably, by being, concerned about it or afraid about it, we can postpone it for a while. So the idea is basically the mere fact that we really, really want to live forever, and that we're afraid of death, doesn't prove we're immortal. And then a person might say, well, what good is the fear of death if we're just going to die anyways? And Hume's response is kind of the same thing you'd hear from, contemporarily, and from the people who support evolutionary theory. The idea would be we have the fear of death because by being afraid of death we survive longer, able to reproduce, and that trait gets passed on, roughly speaking. To close, he does note that there's a considerable advantage in defending a negative, namely that there is no immortality. Why? Well, in this case, the burden of proof is on trying to prove immortality, and that's pretty difficult. And his claim is essentially that, there is no immortality, and so it's up to the other person to prove it. And he believes that this is a pretty decisive thing. Now, like with the other stuff he's done, he does sort of present something that may be slightly confusing or sarcastic. He notes that if we stick with our normal logic, we have no way of proving immortality, or so he claims. Other people, of course, think otherwise. And he says what we need is either some kind of new logic, some new way to prove this, which we don't have, or alternatively, through divine revelation. Now, this could be taken as being him being kind of sarcastic, like, this is all ridiculous, you need some kind of new logic or divine revelation, that's of course absurd, so no way. Or it could be seen as being serious. If we had, say, a new logic, we could prove this, or through divine revelation, one could know this. The usual interpretation, though, is that Hume is being kind of sarcastic and rejecting this. So just as in terms of test stuff, Hume advances again, or considers three main avenues of argument. The metaphysical, and rejects those. The moral, rejects those. Considers the physical arguments, and claims that all the physical arguments point against immortality. So his ultimate conclusion is not that we're certainly immortal, but that it's the more rational thing to believe that we're not immortal, and that the only way to sort of justify such a belief would be to create a new logic or divine revelation. So his final conclusion is skeptical. There is no reason to think we have immortality. And then he died, and I guess he got to get the answer himself. Okay, so that brings to the end of our good dead friend David Hume. Died in 1776. Going to answer the question of if there's immortality, either yes or no, before moving away from our good dead friend Dave to our good dead friend Emmanuel. Anything about Dave that needs more Dave stuff? The next dead thinker is our good dead friend Immanuel Kant. He was born in 1724 and died in 1797, and is of course still dead today. Did all kinds of stuff. He wrote in metaphysics, well, probably best known for his work in metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. He wrote various works, probably the most famous being The Critique of Pure Reason, There's also the critique of practical reason and various other works. People who study Kant, who basically base their entire life and career on Kant, divide philosophy into pre-Kantian and post-Kantian, because they think he's super important. Now, we'll see more of Kant later. When we get to part 4, talking about value theory, we'll see Kant's view of ethics. And his view of ethics is basically a rule-following view. If you had a bumper sticker for Kant, it would say, follow the rules. Now, what we're looking at for him, though, here is his look at the existence of God. Now, kind of like Hume, and he was influenced by Hume, and a famous quote from Kant said, you know, reading Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers. It kind of like woke him up. I guess so he could be dogmatic while he was awake. Now, he ends up basically looking at it the following way. He claims there are only 3 ways to argue for God. And what he's going to do is basically, as we saw before, the classic argument by elimination. One version of this, of course, is kind of the Sherlock Holmes way. If you got like 5 suspects, and these are the only possible 5, and someone did it, if you eliminate, 4 of them, whoever's left has got to be the guilty party. And then, of course, there's the total annihilation method. If you've got, in this case, 3 alternatives, and they all fail, then there can be no success. In Kant's going for total annihilation. So what are these ways? Well, the first argument is one we saw before with our good dead friend St. Anselm, the ontological argument. And he presents kind of the generic version, which is this. First, I can conceive of a perfect being. The conceivable is possible. So it's possible there is a perfect being. So if the perfect being exists, then it's got all perfections. Existence is a perfection, quality. So if a perfect being exists, it's got existence. It's possible that a perfect being necessarily exists. It would be absurd to deny its existence, so a perfect being must exist necessarily. So it's our old argument, God is perfect, so he's going to exist, because if he didn't, he wouldn't be perfect, but he is, so he does. Now, Kant thinks there's 2 basic problems with this argument. Problem 1. He does agree that if you take the concept of God, and to use my usual crappy analogy, if you had like a list of ingredients, a box of God cereal, you would see on the list this notion, being an absolutely necessary being. Now he draws an analogy to the nature of a triangle. If you get a triangle, we know that the nature of the triangle is such that it's got to be 3-sided. So if you had like triangle cereal, it would say on the list of qualities of the triangle, 3-sided. Now, as he notes, the fact that a triangle is 3-sided doesn't prove the triangles exist. And in some ways, this can be seen as sort of like not a great example, because what people sometimes say is, but triangles do exist. We can see them all the time. I always try to like maybe change it a bit by using my stupid addition to it, which is the the trilogon. Imagine a trillion-sided figure. We know what it is. If you get a trilogon like in your hand, it's got to have a trillion sides. But do they exist? Well, no idea. We know what they are, but the fact that a trilogon has a trillion sides doesn't prove it exists. And we have no idea if there's a trilogon anywhere in the universe. So, going along back to God, if God does exist, then there must be a being that exists necessarily. But, he claims, we could deny that such a being exists. Just like me going back to my crappy trilogon thing, we always would say, okay, trilogon is defined as a trillion-sided figure. Okay, got it. Can't picture it, but I got it. Whole bunch of sides. So if it does exist, it's got trillion sides. But I can deny there is such a thing. I mean, it makes sense to say, yeah, I know what a trillion-sided figure is, but I don't think there's anywhere in the universe. It doesn't occur in nature, probably, and why would anybody make such a weird thing? Not impossible, but pretty unlikely. And so what Kant says is we can do the same thing with God. Sure, if God does exist, he's a necessary being, But a person can, contrary to Anselm, say, there's no such thing, or so he claims. So that's the first refutation. So a quick recap, ontological argument is the perfect thing. God is perfect, so he's got to exist, because if he didn't, he wouldn't be perfect, but he is, so he does. First reply is, going directly against Anselm, is that even if you accept that God has got to be a necessary being, if he exists, you can, again contrary to Anselm, say that there is no such being, and it's consistent. Just like you can say, I accept triangles have three sides, but I deny their existence. Or, better example, I accept the trilagons have a trillion sides, but I deny there is one. Before going to a second refutation, anything about the first that needs more first stuff? The second refutation goes like this. Now, one of the things people have debated in metaphysics for some time is what it is to exist. What is existence? And Anselm's argument and the ontological argument rests on existence being a quality that something has. Going back to my crappy, Mr. Potato Head analogy, it'd be like if you think of all the properties and Mr. Potato Head as a substance, existence would be like a property you stick on there. And for Anselm, that's how existence seemed to work. The idea is that God's got all properties perfectly, so he's got to have existence. Because if he didn't have that quality, he'd be missing a quality. He'd be imperfect. Since he's perfect, he's got to exist. And so people have raised the question of, is existence really a predicate? Which is a way of saying, is it a quality or property of things? Now, Kant's argument is this. He claims that existence is not a property that adds to the concept of something. And to use an example, if you think of like or any object, think of like a grapefruit. Now think of a existing grapefruit. Did your picture change at all? And the answer is probably no. Or think of like an exit sign, and think of an existing one. The concept seems to be the same. So if existence is not a property, then it can't be an essential property because it's not a property. Now the way I usually illustrate this is with another crappy analogy. Imagine if someone asked me like what kind of vehicle I drive. And I say, well, of course, my great salary, I drive a Lamborghini. People say, well, what color is it? I say, well, red, of course. And I say that I've got, the Corinthian leather seats, the Dolby 20.1 surround sound, because, Dolby 7 is for little people. And, talk about all, it's got like all kinds of stuff, Blu-ray, player, and of course it's self-driving. That way I can watch my Blu-ray movies while my car is driving me around. And of course it goes underwater and flies as well. And then someone says, hey, can we see this awesome car? And I say, well, tragically, once I bought all that other stuff, once I bought, like the James Bond package so it could fly and go underwater, I couldn't afford the last little option, namely that optional feature of existence. So is existence an optional feature? Like if you go to buy a car, do you have to pay extra for existence? No, you pay extra maybe for having the sunroof, or it used to be for trucks. Remember, years ago, we used to do the bumper. The rear bumper was like extra for real. It's like seriously. Then eventually they said we should probably put bumpers on trucks again. Yeah, and so there's all kinds of options you can get, but there's not the optional existence package. Because existence is not a quality. The car exists or it doesn't. It's not something you tag onto there. So if existence is not a quality, then the argument fails, because it rests on, here's a list of God's ingredients, existence has got to be there, because otherwise we didn't have all these qualities, he'd be imperfect, so he's got to exist. And Kant's view is basically, well, existence is not really a quality you got there. It doesn't go on the list. It's something else. Not surprisingly, philosophers still wonder what existence, is. Because we speak about it as if it's a property. We say things like, unicorns don't exist, but kiwis, the fruit of the bird, do. Just like we'd say, kiwi is a bird, we'd say kiwis exist. So we kind of talk like it's a property. But it's an interesting question of whether it is or not. And it probably can't be, because in order to have a property, something's got to exist, so it couldn't have the property of existence without existing. That gets all kinds of weird stuff. Okay, second refutation is basically existence is not a property. The argument rests on existence being property, so argument fails. Before I go on to the last two, the cosmological and teleological, it needs more stuff. Okay. Now the cosmological arguments that we saw before, basically the causal arguments. You got to have, this, necessary existing first cause that causes everything. Now, one thing that Kant is kind of known for, and this is in his epistemology, is this. One of the things he's looking for in discussing, what kind of stuff we can know, is a problem we looked at when we talked about epistemology. Namely this. What is the boundary of what we can know? And is there stuff beyond it, beyond our knowledge? And Kant believed, yes, there is a boundary to our knowledge. And essentially, very crudely put, it's kind of within the realm of what we can experience. And what lies beyond that is presumably unknowable. We want to talk about that stuff. It's irresistible, because we always wonder, what lies beyond? What's beyond our knowledge? But the problem is, of course, if we go beyond what we can know, we're just kind of speculating crazily. Now, in terms of, for Kant, what lies beyond what we can know, what he said was, it included things, not surprising, like God, metaphysical freedom, free will, and other such things. And so his view was there are things like out here, like in the shadows, so to speak, that maybe they're out there, but we don't know, can't know them. They're beyond us. He also famously divided things up into what he called the phenomena, which is the stuff we experience. This is like the phenomena, and the noumena. The noumena is what's really real for real, which is what's supposed to lie under the phenomena. But of course we can't know the noumena because we don't experience it. But anyways, getting back to this argument. Now, he claims, with the cosmological argument, we've got to use the principle that everything has got a cause. Now, in our normal realm of experience, we never encounter, as far as we know, we never encounter anything that's uncaused. Everything that occurs is caused by something, as far as we know. Now, it could be totally wrong about that, but we'll go with his argument. Now, the problem is, of course, according to Kant, is this only applies to the realm of experience. And roughly put with this badly drawn illustration, our experience doesn't extend to the beginning, the creation of the universe. So, it is beyond what we can know. And hence, according to Kant, we can't use this argument, because to make it go, we've got to argue beyond what we know. And according to Kant, can't do this. And of course it also inherits the defects of the ontological argument, because assumes the perfect being, blah blah blah. So according to Quip, the gist of his attack on the cosmological argument is, it requires us to know what we cannot know. So therefore the argument can't work. So fail. Lastly is the teleological argument, which it's the argument from design. Works like this. You look around at the universe, stuff seems pretty well designed. The planets orbit around the sun and only occasionally crash into each other. We've got, pretty cool hands, opposable thumbs, and eyes and liver and all that cool stuff. Everything seems to work really, really well. So there's a design, no design without a designer. The designer is God, God exists. Now Kant really, 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 really likes this argument, likes it a whole bunch. And he thinks that sort of ironically, given the state of science today, he claimed that every advance in science, in terms of the order of the universe, points more and more towards design. The more we learn about it, the more designed it seems, or so he claims. But the problem we run into again is Kant's view about the limits of knowledge. That in order to know that God designed the world that he created it, designed it, we'd have to know beyond our experience, the limits of our knowledge. We can't do that. The best we can do, according to Kant, is basically going back to Plato's view, that we can say that there's pre-existing matter and there's a design imposed upon it. But since we can't know beyond the limits of our knowledge, we can't know the world was created. So the best we can do, according to Kant, is say there seems to be a design, but we don't know if it was created, because that lies beyond our knowledge. And so he thinks that argument, though he really likes it, also fails. So, 3 possible ways to argue for God according to Kant: ontological, cosmological, teleological. These are the only 3 ways. They all failed, so there's no way to prove God's existence. Now, interestingly, or poorly enough, he runs into the following conclusions. First, any attempt to prove God's existence won't work, can't do it. But the flip side of the coin is, it's also impossible to prove that God does not exist. So, both the theist, who believes, and the atheist cannot know. So, what he says is this: even though we can't claim to have knowledge based in reason, this leaves open the possibility of basing religion on what he calls practical or moral faith. And so his ultimate result is this: he claims that his goal was to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. So his conclusion ultimately is, there are 3 arguments, they all failed, he can't prove or disprove God. So what does this entail? Well, his view is that we can't know either way, so what's left? Faith. And so he ends up, in a way, being kind of skeptical. We can't know, but does allow for belief on the basis of faith. And then he died, and he's still dead today. Before going to the end of this section, looking at our good dead friend Blaise Pascal, anything about Kant that needs more Kantian stuff?
You said any attempt to prove God was wrong.
Oh, he says all attempts to prove God's existence are fruitless, which is a fancy way of saying it's not gonna work. Anything else? Okay, last guy is the famous guy Blaise Pascal. He was born in 1623 and died pretty young in 1662, and is of course still dead today. In his own time, did a fair, in his short life, he did a fair amount of work on such interesting things as vacuums, not like vacuum cleaners, but the idea of vacuum, mathematics, etc. And his main works in philosophy are the Lettres Provinciales and his best known work, the Pensées. And then of course he died, still dead today. Interestingly enough, there's an old programming language that I learned centuries ago when I was in high school called Pascal. I can still vaguely remember it. I don't think anybody uses it today. Well, actually probably some companies still run it in their mainframes. Now Pascal is most famous for his wager. It's kind of his enduring claim to fame. And it begins in the following way. He claims, and then, as I mentioned before, back in the ancient days when we started this section, we talked about how there are those who believe you can use reason to argue for or against God, and there are those who say reason is no help. And then I mentioned that in the camp that where reason is no help, there's Pascal as a special case. And here's him being special. He claims we cannot know God's nature or existence, unknowable. Although then he says his existence is known through faith, which seems kind of consistent, but there you go. So the problem he begins with is basically this. We cannot know God's nature or existence, unknowable. Now at this point, it would seem the rational thing to do would just be to say, well, can't know it, so the best thing to do is be like maybe a skeptic, or maybe be like Kant and just say, I have no way of proving it, but I'm just going to believe based on like faith. But if he just said that, he wouldn't be famous. So why can God not be known? Well, here's his argument. He claims if God exists, then God must be infinitely incomprehensible. Not just incomprehensible, but infinitely incomprehensible. Probably like tax law or something like that. According to Pascal, he has no parts or limits, so has no affinity to us, nothing like us. So because of this, because God is so infinitely incomprehensible, is partless, limitless, totally unlike us, we have no capacity to know if God exists or even what God is. And we dare not undertake this because it's so far beyond us. So in many ways, he's sort of, we've seen as kind of anticipating, Kant. He's essentially saying God is so far beyond our capacity to know that we can't claim to know if God exists or even what God is. And so the natural conclusion is God's existence cannot be proven. And people who believe in God can't be blamed for not proving it. Because if they proved it, oddly enough, they would disprove their claim. Now, this does, of course, lead to an objection. Namely, this does excuse people who already believe. What are people who don't? So what Pascal is going to do, and this is why his claim to fame, he's not going to prove God exists. Because he says that's impossible, can't be done. So he's not going to try the impossible. What he's going to do is something rather different. It may seem very similar, but actually it's quite different. He's going to try to prove that, not that God exists, but that God is your best bet. Basically using gambling theory. To use kind of, the obvious analogy, it'd be like working out a gambling strategy. Namely, if you have no way of, say, knowing how things are going to go, which is, in proper gambling, you don't know, because it's supposed to be all by chance, you can, however, still work out a rational way to bet. So if you're playing, poker or roulette or something, you don't know what the outcome's going to be, unless it's totally rigged, but there are rational ways to bet, which is why people are able, you might have heard of people, of some famous students from MIT who worked out a system with a professor to beat the games. And there are things like counting cards and other techniques that will get you thrown out of casinos or possibly killed, depending on whatever casino it is. But it's a similar sort of deal. It's engaging in basically a gambling thing. You can't know, but you can figure out how to bet. So here's how he lays out the wager. There are, of course, when he lays it out, two options. God exists, or he does not. And so we can lay it out as kind of like a fairly, initially kind of a simple game. So we can set up a little, crappily drawn matrix. There's two options in our game. There can be God or no God. And we can bet, two ways. You can bet for God or against God. So there are the following possible outcomes. You can bet for God and get it right. You can bet for God, get it wrong. You can bet against God, get it wrong, bet against God, and get it right. So there are four ways, basically two ways to bet, four possible outcomes. Now, the way he has set it up, you have no way of knowing the result. You have no, according to him, you can't know whether God exists or God does not. Because if you did, obviously, you wouldn't need to bet. Or you know exactly how to bet, there'd be no question about it. Maybe, going with the analogy of roulette, if you know the game's rigged, and it's going to be like 21 red, you just put on 21 red, you win. But the way he sets it up, we don't know. So we have to decide how to bet. Now, reason, of course, in this initial setup is useless. To use, the obvious analogy, think it's just like a coin toss. You know, if you know that there's an honest coin being flipped, it's going to be heads or tails. Which one is it going to be? You have no way to choose because it's 50-50. Now, one option might be, of course, if you have no way of knowing, you know, how to bet. One smart thing might be, the obvious thing would be, just don't play the game. You know, it's kind of like the old classic movie, you know, War Games. The only way to win is nuclear wars. Don't play the game. Now, Pascal says, he doesn't give an argument, but he says, just in one sentence, you've got to wager. So, sort of first condition is, according to Pascal, you can't know. He does put a thing like, you know, by faith, etc., but he's essentially talking to people who don't already believe. So you can't know which it is. The second thing is, for him, is, you know, reason can't help you at all. Then the question is, so why do I have to play this game? And he says, you got it. Now, he doesn't give an argument. He just says, you're embarked, you have to play. The only thing, you know, people have speculated, one possibility might be is, well, if you go through life, you kind of got to go one way or the other. I mean, to use kind of a stupid illustration, either you go to, like, church or you don't. Either you, like, act a certain way or you don't. So yes, the idea is you kind of have to, you know, swing one way or the other. So how do you choose? Well, again, as he said, there's no way to tell by reason. It's like flipping a coin. Reason tells you it's got to be either heads or tails, but you have no idea which. So how do you bet? Well, he claims what you get to lose is the true and the good, and two things are at stake: reason and will, knowledge and happiness. And we want to avoid error and misery. But he says again, we get to choose. So how do we bet? Well, this is how he sort of plays it out. Like with any gambling, you look at the odds, in this case 50-50, so that doesn't help which way to play. And so then you have to go to the second sort of thing is, which is the payoff, what you're putting up at risk and what you're potentially getting. And the smart way to gamble is always that. What is the cost, what are you risking, the cost to play, so to speak? What is your chance of winning, and what is the payoff? And there's, for those who are interested in gambling, there's all kinds of complex mathematics for working that out. People who are good at this sort of thing know how to do all that stuff. Which is why people who are good at it never play the lottery, because basically it's a tax on people who are bad at that. Or something like that. But as I say, you don't play, you can't win. Of course, if you don't play, you can't lose either. So how do we work this out? Well, crudely put, this is what he claims. If you gain all, if you bet for God. If you lose nothing. And so the thing to do is wager that God is. That's what he claims. To illustrate it, kind of roughly, here's kind of the picture he's presented. If you bet for God and you get it right, you get everything, infinite gain. So huge plus. If you bet for God and there's no God, you lose nothing. So no loss, he claims. If you bet against God and God exists, huge loss. If you bet against God and God doesn't exist, you get nothing. Now, to use a crappy illustration, imagine kind of a weird Twilight Zone scenario. You're captured by some crazed person, and they say get a play. You're like locked in a chair. Like, oh crap! The person says you must choose. If you bet we'll use a coin toss. If you bet heads, and it is heads, you get $1 billion. If you bet heads and it's wrong, nothing. You just walk away. If you bet, tails, and it is heads, then you're dropped into the pit below, which is full of rabid sharks. I don't know if sharks can get rabies, but these are special sharks. They get rabies. And if you bet, four tails, and the result is tails, then you just get let go. So how do you bet? Yeah, heads. The worst that happens is you walk away. The best that happens, you walk away with $1 billion. So, it's win or not lose. If you bet tails, the best that happens is you walk away, but there's always a chance of the whole rabbit shark thing. And so, even though you don't know which is, assuming the person is like, mad, but plays fair, you have no idea which is going to be, but as long as you know what you're playing for, you know how to bet, because this bet is the winning bet. And Pascal says, you bet for God, you get it right, big win. You bet for God, you're wrong, You bet against God, you get it wrong, ooh, big loss. You bet against God, you get it right, you get nothing. So, rational bet for God, or so it claims. Now, being a careful thinker, he does lay out the some considerations. Maybe a person is wagering too much, but he says, suppose you get and he uses like the example or illustration of like betting your life, so to speak. Suppose you could gain 2 lives by betting 1, 50-50. Now he says that's a good bet. Is he right? Well, it depends on your view of your assessment of risk. One thing that does impact, of course, when you're gambling or taking any risk, is sort of your values. I mean, this is something that applies not just to Pascal's wager, but things like investment, retirement insurance. The idea being like, how much risk are you willing to take? Now, but straight by the math, the usual view is if your gain balances out with your risk, it's a good bet. So suppose we had a scenario where you could gain 2 lives by risking 1 life with a 50% chance. Well, your 50% chance of getting 2, which is basically 1, so it's 1 for 1. So if Pascal think that's a fine bet. And again, whether you think it's a good bet or not would depend on your values. Is it worth risking, say, 1 thing to get 2 when it's only 50-50? Because you may decide you might just want to keep the 1 thing. Now, suppose you had 3 lives to gain, 50-50. Well, that would be even better. That could be a good bet. Or you could use like money. Imagine you've got $1 million. There's an investment where there's a 50% chance of doubling your money. Pascal would say that would be a good bet. But suppose you have a 50% chance of getting back $3 million. Well, an even better bet. Now, he does, grind a lot through the numbers, but rather than going through it, kind of incredible detail, he does consider this. For example, suppose there was an infinity of chances of, in terms of being correct. And he contends that this would be a good bet, because the gain, he claims, is an eternity of life and happiness, and even if the chances were, say, 1 in infinity, if your win is infinite, it's still a good bet, or so he claims. So the gist of this, rather than grind through all the mathematics for it, what he basically says is this: it's a good bet, because if you look at it in terms of the odds, in this case the standard version is 50-50. Betting a particular way gets you, either great gain or no loss. Betting another way gets you great loss or no gain. Even if you work it out so the odds were even worse, as long as the gain is super high and he thinks the gain is infinite, then it's still a smart bet, or so he claims. So the gist of it is basically, by the math, given what you're risking, getting what you're gaining, it's a smart bet, or so he claims. Now, a person, of course, may raise an objection, namely, the gain is uncertain. You don't know if you're going to win. Your risk is certain, because as we'll see in just a moment, for Pascal, like with roulette, you just put down your money. With the God thing, you just don't put down your money on God. You've got to do the whole deal, as we'll see in a bit. So you are putting up some stake in the game. But he says this is reasonable. to stake a certainty against an uncertainty. Now again, this could be debated, because it's basically a question about, risk assessment. But in general, is he right? Well, do we every day stake certainties against uncertainties? Do we take risks to get gains? Yeah, for example, getting into class, there was a non-zero chance you wouldn't make it. You probably had to cross a road. There's a chance you might not get to the other side. Getting in your car, you're driving, there's a chance you might not make it. So leaving your house is a risk. Actually, staying in your house is a risk too, because your house can totally kill you. So everything's a risk anyway. But we take risks like that. Getting in your car, going to school is a risk, and the hope is you'll get some kind of gain. Going to work, same deal. It's a risk. But we essentially, as he sees it, we risk things. So it does seem, reasonable, the idea that we risk to gain. So the gist of all of this is basically the wager is rational, basically if you work out the mathematics, or so we class. Because there's such a huge amount of gain, and the gain is so potentially awesome, totally worth the risk. So to recap up to this point, the base idea is this. You get a wager because you can't know, according to Pascal. You can't know because God is infinitely incomprehensible, nothing like us. So unless you already have faith, you have no idea whether God is or what he is. So the wager is aimed at people who already don't believe. He says you get two options, God or no God. And the rational thing would seem to be not bad, because you'd be like someone flipping a coin. How do you pick? Well, you can't. It could be either. And then he works out kind of the matrix for it. If before God you get it right, huge gain. Before God you're wrong, nothing. But against God you get it wrong, huge loss. But against God you get it right, you get nothing. Smart bet for God. And then he considers, again, working out kind of the mathematics of like, when is it rational to bet, and you're weighing risk against gain and so forth. And his ultimate conclusion is, no matter how you work the numbers, God is totally your best bet. Or so he claims. Before pressing on, anything about that needs any more Las Vegas stuff? So he takes this to be, proven, totally proven. So not only is his view like, this is kind of cool, his view is, this is how you should conclude. And he certainly implies, it doesn't directly state, this is essentially like deductive reasoning. This is just how you should bet. It's demonstrable. Now, but here's the catch, because there's always the catch. Now, as I mentioned, if you go to, say, Las Vegas, or play the lottery, for example, do you have to really believe the number you're playing, or where you're putting your money? Do they like scan your brain to see if you truly believed? No. So to win at roulette, you just got to put your money down in the right place. You don't have to truly believe it. Unfortunately, in the case of betting for God, there's not like, it's not like you get like a little card, you say, all on God. For Pascal, the way you wager is you're going to make yourself believe. Now, of course, the problem is that people making the wager would make the wager because they don't believe. If someone already believes, they don't need the wager. They already believe. So it's someone who is already like either skeptical or an atheist, and his view is, if he's convinced you, you wouldn't believe in God at this point because all he's proven is not that God exists, that God is the best bet. To use a crappy analogy, it'd be like going to Vegas, and you run to somebody, an eccentric genius, and she says, I got this math all worked out. When you play the cards, I'll give you a little signal to bet or not bet. And if you trust them and you believe that they're right, well, you may still not believe what the next card is going to be. You have faith in it. You're just hoping that the system will work out. But with Pascal, you have to truly believe. So it'd be like, the eccentric person saying, not only did it work out the system, but here's the weird deal. I can read your mind. And in order for you to win, not only do you have to bet right, you've got to truly, truly, truly believe. If you don't believe, you can't win. And of course that sounds crazy, but the way Pascal sets it up, that's kind of the deal. The way you bet is you make yourself believe. Because if you don't believe, you can't win. So here's his advice. He says what you should do is attain faith. You learn from those who already believe. He says you go to the ceremonies, you take the holy water, you go to church, and he claims this will lessen your passions and deaden your reason, and eventually you'll come to believe. In modern terms, we call this drinking the Kool-Aid. Basically just, accepting it and believing. But he claims it's the rational thing to do. Because again, in order to bet, you've got to truly believe. And again, to use my crappy analogy, it's like having that eccentric, genius who says, I'll signal for which way for you to bet, but you got to truly believe. If you don't believe, it doesn't work. So that does, of course, lead to the question: is that a good idea? Does that work? Before I go on to some problems with this view, anything about the Pascalian so far that needs more Pascalification? Now, logically, the disjunction totally works. It's, of this form, G or not G, which is totally a tautology. Just like today is Wednesday or today is not Wednesday. Totally true, always true. But, first problem is this. Even though this is totally true, it's kind of a false dilemma. And I'll use a crappy analogy to illustrate this. Suppose you go to McDonald's. It's true you can have the Big Mac or not have the Big Mac. Totally true. But are there other options besides the Big Mac? Yeah. You have the Little Mac or the Mini Mac. They have like burgers and other stuff. I've been to McDonald's for a long time. Last time I was killed. No offense to McDonald's. They do have filet. Do they still have filet of fish? It's like weird. It's not really. I'm not sure if it's fish or no. Yeah. But so, and when you go to McDonald's and you're using that thing, it's true, Big Mac or no Big Mac, but there are other options on the menu. You could have the filet of fish. You could have the quarter pounder or the Royale with cheese, depending if you're in France or not. And the point of this is that what seems to be in play is a false dilemma. How so? Well, it's true, God or no God, but those aren't the only alternatives. To illustrate it, think about all the other religions that people have. You could have Buddha, or no Buddha, or you could take variations of monotheism, or Muhammad or no Muhammad, or Jesus or no Jesus, or Book of Mormon or no Book of Mormon. Then you could throw in, you could go back, to blast from the past with Zeus or no Zeus, Thor or no Thor, Odin or no Odin, Quetzalcoatl or no Quetzalcoatl, Tolk or no Tolk, Ra or no Ra, Osiris or no Osiris, Isis or no Isis, the goddess, not the terrorist group. And then you can go back even further, just start bringing out all the deities that humans have worshipped throughout the centuries. But then, of course, you still have to consider maybe there are deities we don't know about. There could be, in theory, an infinite number of these beings, possible religions. And so then the gamble becomes not just God or not God, but what if Buddhism is in play, then you got to choose between God, not God, Buddha, not Buddha. And of course, if you bring in Islam, you got to choose from that. You bring in Judaism, variations of Christianity, paganism, and then the choice becomes really, really difficult. So it would be like, a gambling board with an infinite number of, choices, an infinite number of ways to bet. In that case, what's your best bet? Well, you'd have no way of, because your chance of winning would be 1 in infinity. Now, a person still might say, as Pascal did, that God is still your best bet. Why? Because if you bet right, you'll get heaven, infinite eternal happiness, which would be good. So you might say, even if it's like 1 in an infinity chance of being right, bet for that, because if you get it right, you get infinite, good. But this leads to the second major problem, which is this. We need the wager because we don't know if God exists, and we don't know what God is like. So here's the problem. If we don't know anything about God, which is Pascal's hypothesis, we cannot know how God will react to our belief or disbelief. So we can't know the payoff and loss. Now, going back to our matrix, this, taking Pascal at his word that we don't know, here's how it would go. You bet for God, you get it right. What happens? Don't know. Because by definition, the way Pascal sets it up, you have no idea. You bet for God, there's no God, what happens? Well, you might have possibly a slight loss. You might have to get up earlier on Sundays or Saturdays, depending on which version you pick. Maybe there were some sins you would have been able to commit, but you didn't. Or maybe it would have been good, because maybe a person would lead like a better life. Getting up early is, early to bed, early to rise, makes the person happy, healthy, and wise, type of thing. Now we bet against God, and we're wrong. Again, Pascal's setup is we have no idea how God will react. If we bet against God and we get it right, I guess we're right. Now going back to my crappy analogy with the mad genius person who sets up the trap, imagine the scenario's changed a little bit. The mad genius says, I shall flip a coin, and if you bet heads and you're right, something may or may not happen. But if you are, if you are wrong about it, you bet, then let you go. If you bet, tails, then and you're wrong, something may or may not happen. And if you're wrong, I'll let you go. Now in that case, how do you bet? Well, you have no idea. Because the person basically says, if it's heads or tails, no matter what you pick, something could happen or not. No way of knowing. And so in that case, you might as well guess, because you have no idea what will occur. And so, sort of that fatal problem with Pascal's wager is if you don't know God, which is makes the wager essential, you have no way of deciding how to bet. Now if you combine that with the false dilemma thing, the many gods, then you have an infinite matrix with just full of question marks. You have no idea, for example, to fill it in, you have to know how God would react to, if he exists, how he'd react to you believing in Zeus, or Buddha, or believing in Muhammad, or Jesus, or all the possible combinations. And of course it'd be an infinite matrix with full of question marks, and you have no idea how to bet. So, as one might say, good effort, but no. Because then we'd have no way of rationally picking. Now if we knew that it was limited to two choices, just God exists or God doesn't, and we knew that God would reward people for believing in him, then the wager would make sense. But if we knew that stuff, and we know God exists, then we wouldn't need the wager. So kind of the paradox is that if we don't know God, then we need the wager. But if we don't know God, the wager is useless. If we do know God, we don't need the wager. So either way, bad for the wager. Finally, of course, there's a concern about the ethics of the matter. Namely, is it moral to abandon reason, so to speak, and just make oneself believe something, not because it's supported, but because of the potential for gain? I mean, for example, I could take kind of an extreme example. Imagine like a political party where people, if you believe in the party and never slip up, you always say all the right things, you'd be able to get like advantages. But the party seems to be like totally unfounded, no foundation or reason. So basically just sort of brainwash yourself into believing it. And a fair question would be, is it morally acceptable to just believe things that are totally unfounded in the hopes of personal gain? And some would obviously say, well, yeah, it's all about gain. Other people would say, no, that would be horrible. So that's a good dead friend, Pascal. Did a lot, did some stuff, died, still dead today. Before heading to, I guess, the beginning of part 3, anything about Pascal that needs any more Pascal stuff? Okay, so now we turn to part 3. The deadline for the quizzes for part 3 is June 9th, and then the deadline for the exam is June 17th. The stuff we just finished, part 2, the quizzes deadline on May 28th, so tomorrow. Exam 1 also, which covers the stuff from previously, also deadlines tomorrow. And the stuff where, in the exam, that covers up to where we covered up to just now, deadlines June 9th. And the quizzes will start today, deadlines on June 9th, and then the exam deadlines on June 17th. So part 3, we turn to epistemology and metaphysics. And we'll do a little bit of the introduction, and that will take care of the stuff. Now we'll begin with epistemology, which, as you recall from the ancient days of like the before time, is literally the study or science of knowledge. Episteme means knowledge, ology, study of. And we saw back in those ancient days of week 1 some of the classic problems and questions. And they include such things as, in terms of classic problems, I mentioned before. One that's beloved of Hollywood is, and philosophers, is the problem of the external world. How do you know that what you're experiencing is really real for real, and that you're not in a dream, like in the movie Inception? Or that you're not in a computer simulation like the movie The Matrix or The 13th Floor. There's also the more limited problem of other minds. How do in the question in epistemology, how do you know other people have minds? In the practical sense, it's the question of knowing other people are thinking. When someone tells you something, trust me. How do you know if you should really trust them? Or if they, claim to be thinking or feeling a certain way, how do you really know what's going on with it? And the answer is, of course, you really don't. You just go by despite what Bill Clinton says, who claimed he could feel people's pain, and presumably other stuff, we don't actually do that, as far as we know. None of us have, like, ESP or psychic powers, so we just go by what people seem to be doing. And some people are pretty good actors, so you can't always tell. Now, there are other questions and problems such as, what is knowledge? If a person knows something, what does it involve? What kind of things can we know? What can't we know? That type of stuff. Now, there's also other very practical things. For example, if you follow the news, one of the big news items has been the Patriot Act, which is, if it doesn't get renewed, then it just, stops. Although it probably will be renewed. And that's the thing that allows, has been allowing the government to scoop up all kinds of data, engage in domestic spying, etc., etc. Now, interestingly or boringly enough, things like the Patriot Act and spying do raise questions of epistemology. Namely, how do you know that certain patterns of behavior are the behaviors of, say, a terrorist, as opposed to someone who's not a terrorist? How do we know that this information is useful? It also ties into things like military intelligence. How do we know the intelligence is reliable? How do we know where the targets are? That type of stuff. And so interestingly and boringly enough, the whole spying intelligence thing, even though people often say philosophy is all useless and stuff, it's all essentially applied to epistemology. How do you know that kind of stuff? How much confidence can you put in the evidence that's available? It's all practical epistemology. Now, some of the concepts we've seen before. Back in the ancient days of part 2, we saw that philosophy tends to split into, at least in the West, there are two branches. One branch goes by the name of Rationalism. What do the rationalists accept? Well, basically two things. If you want to be in the rationalist club, two things you got to accept. Also, of course, not talking about rationalist club, because that's the first rule of rationalist club. One, a priori knowledge, which we saw before. If you're a rationalist, you believe you can know the existence of some things by pure reason. And we saw in the previous section how that works. We saw the Ontological Argument, which tries to prove by pure reason that God exists. So, the first hallmark of rationalism is rationalists believe you can prove the existence of things by pure reason. It could be logic, it could be mathematics, it could be proof like we saw with Anselm. But the idea is you can work out the existence of stuff just by thinking about it. Second thing, the notion of what's called innate ideas. One of the big debates in epistemology, well, two of them are. One is, can you know stuff existing just by reasoning it through? And kind of the second one is, when people are born, what's in the mind? Now, the rationalists generally believe in what are called innate ideas, that stuff is built in. And I used the crappy analogy before of, think about today. If you buy a smartphone or laptop, unless your hard drive has been erased, it's already got all kinds of preloaded stuff. It's got an operating system, you got apps and so forth in there. And to use a crappy analogy, innate ideas are like that. It's the idea that the mind is pre-stocked. When you come into existence, you already get stuff in there. Now, there are different views about how that works. For example, say with Plato, the idea is that you're basically learning stuff when you're dead. Other people believe like in a metaphysical thing. For example, Leibniz and Descartes believe God put stuff in there, writes upon the soul. Interestingly, a person could be like a total atheist and a materialist and still believe in innate ideas. For example, one thing that's kind of interesting, or perhaps kind of boring, is the question about our concepts of beauty. Do we construct the concept of beauty? In other words, do we just kind of make that up and have people who are influential and so forth, and we put out, like today we put out, pictures, fashion magazines, models, etc., and then we just define beauty and just kind of program people to accepting that? Or do human beings have a built-in, say, preference, a built-in concept or tendency towards recognizing beauty? And of course, scientists have wondered about that. And one way they tested it was kind of the obvious way. One way would be to take, children before they've been socialized and see how they respond to, pictures, images and people. And what they found is that children have a preference for what we would regard as beautiful, symmetry, etc. They also looked at the thing about, cultural stuff. Because if the idea is that beauty is, cultural, then if you go to different cultures, you'd expect different judgments of beauty. And the way they tested this was taking pictures of people and then basically going around the world and seeing how people reacted. And they found, interestingly, boringly enough, that people generally tended to pick the same way, which lends some evidence to the claim that we have a built-in concept of beauty. Or, as some have claimed, we have a built-in concept of, preferences for appearance. And the evolutionary explanation is that when we see people, we're judging subconsciously their evolutionary fitness in terms of their genetic potential. That's the usual evolution thing. We're wondering like how good their genes are. And we take the appearance to be an indicator of genetic stuff. But anyways, innate ideas, built-in stuff. So if you're a rationalist, you believe you can prove the stuff exists by pure reason. And you tend to believe that the mind comes pre-stocked with ideas and concepts. Our second group are the empiricists. Like we saw before, they believe the only way you can prove stuff exists is by experiments. So if you want to prove like God exists, You can't do it just by working it out by pure reason. You have to begin with some empirical data. You could then bring in reason. You can use logic and math and so forth, but it's got to start with experience. And this is where, of course, we get, empirical science. Another hallmark of the empiricists is they believe that the mind is initially a tabula rasa, a blank slate. There's nothing in there. And the way we get stuff in there is basically by experience. So just draw the line law there. You see stuff like, a square, you get the idea of square. You see other stuff, like a circle, you get the idea of circle, and then you can start doing stuff with that. You can like combine them, make like something that's like half square, half circle, or whatever. So those are the two main camps. You can know by pure reason that stuff exists, you can't. The mind is pre-stocked with ideas, nope, none of that stuff. Now for centuries, when people thought about like what is it to know, kind of the stock accepted answer was called the justified true belief model. Sometimes called JTB. What does that mean? Well, the idea is this. To know something, obviously, you've got to have belief. You've got to believe it. That seems true. Now, but everything we believe, of course, is not knowledge, because we believe a lot of things that aren't true. So the second kind of obvious thing about knowledge is to really know something, it's got to be true. I mean, we do throw around the term knowledge like as if we, I know that, meaning I believe it, but being more strict about it, it's got to be something true. You can't know something that's not true. But of course, there's more to just, or people have argued, there's more to just believing it and being right, because you can just guess. The third factor is what's called justification. That not only do you believe it, not only is it true, but you've got an adequate justification for why. And I'll close with like the kind of the obvious illustration. Think about doing math. Well, one reason why most math, professors and teachers make you do all the stuff, well, one reason is partial credit, because if you get through all that stuff and you're a little off, you get at least some credit for all that stuff. But another reason is to see not just did you get the right answer, because you can get that by guessing, randomly, but to see if you got it in the right way. So you know how to do, say, a math problem. It's more than just, I got the right answer. It would be, I got the right answer, and I got it in the right way. So next time, we'll press on to more adventures in the land of epistemology with our good dead friend returning Plato.